Hey everybody, Mr. Grove here. Today we're going to talk about some genetic disorders. And so we'll talk about some on our list, and then there's a corresponding video that goes along with those. And then there's some questions on the worksheet that you can answer as you're watching the videos. So a fair warning, some of them are a little sad, so maybe have some tissues close by as you watch those. So let's start with the first one, and that's albinism. So somebody who's albino, this would be a homozygous recessive disorder, so you'd have little a to have actual albinism. And what that means is your body is not going to be able to produce pigment. So no pigment in your skin, no pigment in your hair, no pigment in your eyes. And so without that pigment, then you're going to have, basically white skin or white fur. And albinism goes all the way across the animal kingdom. And so, we could have it in squirrels or reptiles or humans or whatever. One common example is in Olney, Illinois. They are the home of the white squirrel. And so Olney is the largest population of albino squirrels in the world. And so they are very proactive in recording data and enhancing regulations against like pets off leashes and making sure that cats have bells on their collars and things. To help enhance the white squirrel population. So if you go over to the city park or go to the campground, there's a good chance that you would actually see a white squirrel. So we have some relatives that live about 10 miles north of Olney, and sometimes I'll do some hunting in the woods, and I have seen white squirrels just in the woods for that. And so that's albinism. As far as humans go, the major danger would be without that pigment in your skin, you're going to be way prone to skin cancer, prone to severe sunburns. With the lack of eye pigment, there's probably some correlation to some potential eye problems. So in our video, Kenyon had some eye issues that was probably connected to his albinism. And so, but one thing albino traits do not do is they don't seem to be nationality specific, as some of these seem to show up more commonly in certain races or ethnic groups than others. So, but that's albinism, and that would be a recessive disorder as well. The next one is cystic fibrosis. And so cystic fibrosis, your body is not going to be able to break down this mucus protein that is created. And so it gets into the lungs, helps put increased susceptibility to organs and pressure on the different types of organs. And so it's very terrible. And a typical person with cystic fibrosis, the benchmark that they hope to achieve would be living to actual adulthood. So if they can make it to age 21 or 18, that's kind of a win, sadly. And so cystic fibrosis also seems to show up more commonly in Caucasians, so white Caucasians. We'll talk about why these show up in certain groups more so than others a little bit later. So not guaranteed to that. So Larry in the video, he was of Hispanic origin, and so and had cystic fibrosis as well. But white Caucasian, the statistic odds of having that are more likely than other ethnic groups. So also recessive, and so that means you'd have to be little c in order to have that. So here's a story related. So Boomer Esiason used to play for the Eagles and Jets in the NFL, and is now currently a commentator for the NFL games. And his son Gunnar has cystic fibrosis. So that means Boomer was a carrier of the trait, so he would be big C, little c, because Boomer himself does not have it, but his kid did. And that means Boomer's wife would also have to be a carrier of the trait. So they both passed the little c on to their son Gunnar. And so Boomer has been very valuable in cystic fibrosis research. He started the Boomer Esiason Foundation, and they've raised well over $100 million to aid in funding and research for cystic fibrosis treatments. So check that out if you get a chance, the Boomer Esiason Foundation. Okay, next we have PKU. And so PKU is one that you actually were tested for in Illinois. at birth. And so PKU is phenylketonuria, and basically what that does is you are not able to digest the protein amino acid phenylalanine. And so it's a pretty easy fix, and that easy fix, as we saw in our video with Kevin, was diet. So basically, if you can't break down phenylalanine, we just don't want to put any of that in your body. And so he doesn't eat meats, he doesn't eat any kind of cheese or proteins, and he's on a very specific, basically, dietary formula. And as long as he stays on that, he's going to be fine. But if he were to go off of that for some time, then that phenylalanine would build up into his body and ultimately would cause cognitive delays and mental retardation to where he would be institutionalized. And so that's one that we test for, whereas cystic fibrosis, not so much, because there's nothing we can do about cystic fibrosis. But PKU, we want to test for that because if caught early, we can totally treat that with something as simple as a certain specific diet. So that's PKU. Next is sickle cell. And so sickle cell is actually one of the more common genetic disorders in African Americans. It shows up in about 1 of every 400, and it's estimated that about 1 in every 10 is a carrier of the trait. And so in this case, what happens is your blood cells become sickle-shaped, and that is not smooth for them to be able to go through those tiny capillaries, and so they get clogged easily. And if they're getting clogged, then that means they are not carrying the oxygen necessary to the organs in the body and to the brain. And so we saw with Alexandria, she was having stroke issues, and a lot of that was due to the lack of oxygen then that her brain was getting because of the sickle cell blood. So it's definitely something that is, again, more common in African Americans. And it's also one of the few where there's actually some traits for being a carrier as well. And so one of the reasons it's probably so common is because if you had sickle cell anemia, then you were going to be hard to compete for food in life and living, and so you'd be more likely to not survive if you were a little less. And if you were big S, you would get bit by a mosquito and be, impacted by malaria. But if you are big S, little s, and a carrier, you had a little bit of immunity to the malaria, and you weren't fighting sickle cell anemia because of the trait. So therefore, this kind of heterozygous advantage existed, and that's one of the reasons it's definitely more common than some of these other disorders. And so that's sickle cell anemia. An example of this was a guy who played for the Steelers. His name was Ryan Clark, really good player, and he was playing in Denver one day, and he had some major issues physically due to the lack of oxygen. And so he does not have sickle cell, but he is a carrier, so he'd be big S, little s. And I think he even had some potential spleen damage to the point where then every time the Steelers would go to Denver, he was not allowed by the team to play in that game, even if it was a playoff game, because of the dangers and the risks for him. So that is sickle cell anemia. The next one we have is also recessive, and so this is Tay-Sachs. So Tay-Sachs is a lipid accumulation in the brain cells, and is actually very tragic at an early age. So most kids do not really hit the age of like 3 to 5 with Tay-Sachs. And so it is diagnosed early, and their developmental issues, both physically and mentally, then start showing up very quickly. And so this one's more common in Jewish nationality, but not limited to that, but it is more common in that area. So we'll point out an example. So this is baby Jenna. So this would be, you'll have to follow with me on this, my wife's brother's wife's sister's daughter. Okay, so my wife, Crystal, her brother, Eric's wife, Carrie, sister, and then her daughter was Jenna. And so no relation to me personally, but clearly Jenna is not from a Jewish nationality, and she was born, and then after several months, then they realized that she was not developing. In fact, was actually regressing a little bit in her physical development. And so then she was diagnosed with Tay-Sachs. And sadly, Jenna is no longer with us, but I always like to tell her story to students so that way her memory can live on. So, but that is baby Jenna, and that is Tay-Sachs. Now for our dominant disorders, we have two of those that we'll talk about. And so the first one is dwarfism. And so dwarfism or achondroplasia, this is going to be someone who is basically small in physical stature. So not just somebody who's a little bit shorter, but somebody who has the physical symptoms of that. And so their limbs are a little bit disproportionate to what a normal person's would be. And there are sometimes some other mobility issues as well. And so here are some common people that you have probably seen in Hollywood. So Kenny Baker actually just recently passed away this year, and so was in Star Wars. And then Warwick Davis was also Star Wars and Harry Potter. I think he was Wicket the Ewok. And then Peter Dinklage in Game of Thrones, and as everybody's favorite, Angry Elf. And then Danny Woodburn was Kramer's buddy on Seinfeld. Mickey, I think, was his name. But these are some people that had dwarfism, so that means that they were big D something. So if you are not dwarfism, then that means you would be little d, little d. So if you're dominant, then that means you're a big D something. So these guys could all be big D, or they could all be big D, little d. So it is, I guess a question that we would ask would be, is it possible for two parents who have dwarfism to have a child of regular size? So think about that for a second. And then the answer would be yes. So if both mom and dad were big D, little d, then that means they would exhibit dwarfism. But if they pass that little d on to their child, their kid could be little d, and be of normal stature. So it is kind of possible. There was a Discovery Channel show, I think it was, Little People, Big World, that chronicled a family as several members of the family also had dwarfism. So definitely survivable, but there are some physical issues that go along with that as well. So, but I think these guys would all be great examples of how you can overcome your odds and be successful in what you do, no matter what you have. So that is dwarfism. And then one last one that we'll talk about is Huntington's. And so Huntington's disease, in some ways, I think is the most terrible of all of them. And so you have your video where Chris Furby documents his mother with Huntington's. And so basically what happens around age 40, Huntington's starts to show up. And so it has kind of physical effects like Parkinson's, and then the mental effects like Alzheimer's, kind of the worst of both. And so what makes it terrible is by age 40, you've probably already had kids. And so since it's dominant, if you are big H something, then you will have Huntington's. And so this will show up in you around age 40. And so there's a good chance that a parent would have it, and then if they have it, then there's a 50-50 chance they're giving that dominant gene to their kid or to all of their kids. So it's not just one issue showing up in a family like some of these recessive orders would be. It could cut a swath through several members of a family in generation after generation. So just a terrible, sad disease, and hopefully maybe someday we can have a cure for that. But that is Huntington's. Now, as you see, some of these show up more commonly in certain nationalities than others. So like Caucasians for cystic fibrosis, African Americans for sickle cell, Tay-Sachs for Jewish people. And it's not that it's limited to that, but our mindset for the longest time, whether right or wrong, a good Jewish boy would come home and marry a good Jewish girl, and they would have good Jewish children. Or a good African American boy would marry a good African American girl and have good African American kids. And that was kind of the cultural mindset that was kind of pressured on many of these members of different ethnic groups and nationalities. And so because of that, we were limiting the gene pool of what we were pulling from. And so some of these traits would then be concentrated and show up, like cystic fibrosis with Caucasians. It's kind of like in selective breeding with dogs. So if we have very specific dogs breeds, like Dalmatians, they will show up with some specific genetic issues like deafness or blindness, or labs with their hip dysplasia. And so by limiting the gene pool, yes, we're getting purebred, but we're also breeding in some of these genetic disorders. So this is some of the genetic disorders. Definitely watch your videos and finish out your questions, and go hug somebody you love and be thankful for your health, because it definitely makes you think twice about that gift you were given. So, and we'll talk to you later, and smash that like button.